Did you know there was a medieval punishment that made the victim hear the sound of their flesh boiling until their last breath? Sounds like a horror story, but it's a historical fact. A punishment that existed in both Europe and Mongolia, used as a deterrent, a punishment, and sometimes a political weapon. Imagine, you're tied up and dropped into a pot of cold water. At first it's just a numbing sensation, but then, as the minutes pass, the burning heat seeps through every crevice of your skin. The water starts to ripple, then gurgling, and by the time you realize what's coming, it's too late to escape. But what makes this punishment most haunting is the case of Richard Roose, who was turned into a pot of power in front of hundreds of eyes. Why did he have to suffer that fate? And was he really guilty? To understand, we must go back to the social context of that time, where absolute power often went hand in hand with absolute cruelty. To understand why boiling alive existed, we have to go back to a time when the law was the voice of the rulers. In Europe, it was the Middle Ages, when kings held immutable absolute power. In Mongolia, it was the time when the great Khans conquered the continent. In the 14th to 16th centuries, Europe was rife with poisoning plots. In the palace, a single bowl of soup could tip the balance of power. Kings and nobles were obsessed with preserving life, and boiling alive became a bloody warning to anyone who dared to betray them. In England, under Henry VIII, the punishment was specifically for poisoning. The king believed that poisoning was a vile and treacherous act, and so the guilty person had to suffer a painful and public death so that everyone could see the consequences. In the East, the Mongols had a similar approach, but not just for poisoners. Spies, traitors to the army, even important prisoners, could all be cooked alive, not for revenge, but to strike fear into the minds of all enemies. Imagine you are a Western merchant who stumbles into a captured Mongolian city. In the square, a large pot is boiling. The people are silent, except for the sound of the fire. The man tied up inside is a man who has sold military secrets to the enemy. No one says a word, because everyone knows. One wrong look, and you will be next. Both cultures, though different in geography and customs, have one thing in common. They understand that a slow, public, haunting death will be etched into the collective memory. It is the politics of fear. And fear is the invisible chain that holds power. But how can they prolong the pain of the victim for as long as possible? The mechanics of this punishment are so brutal that, once you know, you may never forget. If what you just heard makes you shudder, keep reading, because the next part will show you in detail every step of a cooking alive, and why it is so coldly calculated. This was not a quick death. The punishment of being cooked alive was designed to prolong the pain. First, a huge copper pot or cauldron was placed on the stove. Water, or sometimes oil, was filled. Depending on the level of the ritual, they might start when the water was cold, to ensure that the victim would remain conscious throughout the process. The victim was tied tightly, usually with their hands behind their backs, their legs bent. Some places placed them in an iron basket or wooden frame to make it easier to lift and lower them. Some accounts describe guards stirring the water to spread the heat evenly. Imagine it. At first it was cold, then lukewarm, then hot. At this point, the skin began to turn red. Steam rushed straight into the nose, making breathing difficult. The body trembled, not just from fear, but from the screaming nerves. When the temperature reaches around 50-60 degrees Celsius, the skin starts to blister. At 70 degrees Celsius, the outer layer of skin can peel off, but the person remains conscious. That's the goal. To buy time until the temperature exceeds 100 degrees Celsius, when serious damage begins to occur to the internal organs. And there are more brutal versions. In some places they add wine, milk, or even spices to the water. Not to make it taste better, but to spread the aroma, to increase the humiliation, to turn the victim into a dish in front of the public eye. It's not all about killing, but to send a message. Power can decide not only whether you live or die, but also how you die. And when it comes to messages of deterrence, no case is more shocking than that of Richard Roose, an ordinary chef, suddenly a criminal, cooked alive in front of the London public. The sequel will take you to the case that made this punishment forever recorded in the history books. Stay tuned, because the story will make you wonder whether justice really existed in those days. February 15th, 1531. London was freezing cold. In a corner of the kitchen of St. Sepulchre Church, a man was hiding in the shadows. His name was Richard Roose, a cook serving a noble family. According to the accusation, Richard had slipped a poison into the porridge being prepared for the host and his distinguished guests. As a result, 2 people died. Dozens more were in pain. The news spread quickly throughout the city, reaching King Henry VIII. Imagine, in a society that feared being poisoned, this incident was like a bombshell. The cook, the most trusted person in preparing food, was now considered the worst traitor. Henry VIII was not only famous for his power, but also for his public punishments. And this time, he chose an unprecedented method: to punish Richard Roose by being cooked alive. On the day of the execution, a giant copper pot was erected right on the banks of the Thames. Crowds gathered, jostling to watch. When the guards escorted Richard, his face was pale, but strangely calm. The fire flared up. The water began to ripple. Richard was tied up, placed on an iron basket, and slowly lowered. An eyewitness recounted. He screamed 3 times, each time fainter, until only the gurgling sound drowned out everything. But was Richard really guilty? Some sources claim that he had accidentally put in the wrong ingredients. Some even believe that this was an excuse for the court to show off its power, sending a warning message to all the kitchen staff and servants. Whatever the truth, Richard Roose's death has become one of the most haunting executions in Britain. But he was not the only one to suffer this punishment. On the other side of the continent, the Mongols also practiced boiling alive, and they were even more ruthless. Stay tuned, because in the next part, we will enter the world of the Mongol warriors, where boiling pots were not just for criminals, but also a tool of war. In Europe, boiling alive was a warning for treason or poisoning, but in the East, under the Great Khans, it was also a weapon of war. The Mongols, famous for their mobile and disciplined armies, had no tolerance for any act of treachery. A captured spy, a traitorous commander, or a valuable prisoner could all be summarily executed in a boiling pot in the middle of the camp. Imagine, you are a Persian merchant arrested on suspicion of espionage. In the middle of the steppe, hundreds of warriors are gathered. In the middle is a giant pot on an iron tripod. When the guards drag you in, the smell of smoke and burning fat hits your nose. No one says a word, because everyone knows this is the time to spread fear. The historian Rashid al-Din recorded that during a campaign in Central Asia, a traitor general was captured and cooked alive in front of his troops, as a lesson that a traitor is boiled before he is forgiven. Marco Polo also mentioned this punishment, describing it as a way to make discipline spread faster than arrows. Unlike Europe, the Mongols saw this not as a punishment, but as a ritual. Each execution was witnessed by the entire army, from beginning to end. It was a way to turn fear into a collective memory, so that no one would dare betray. There are records that they even added salt to the water, not only to increase the boiling point, but to make the cracking sound of flesh more audible. The purpose? To make the memory etched in the minds of the witnesses for life. In the next part, we'll delve into the psychology and power strategy behind boiling alive, to understand why it doesn't just kill people, but also controls crowds. Boiling alive is not just a way to kill. It is a psychological tool. It plays directly on the most primitive instinct of human beings, the fear of being burned, of being cooked while still alive. The authorities of the time understood. When a death is carried out publicly, slowly, and with sounds, smells, it will be engraved in the memory of everyone who witnesses it. It is a lesson that they never want to experience. Imagine yourself as a 16th century Londoner, crowded in the crowd on the banks of the Thames. You hear the sound of boiling water, the intermittent screams, the smell of burning flesh wafting through the cold air. You don't need anyone to remind you. You understand the message. Never betray. The fear of a painful death makes people willing to obey to avoid a similar outcome. The crowd effect. When everyone witnesses it, they reinforce each other's belief that the authority of the ruler is absolute. Symbolism. The boiling pot became associated with betrayal and punishment. Unlike beheading, quick and clean, boiling alive is a process. The viewer is forced to accompany the victim's death, indirectly experiencing the pain. That creates a more lasting deterrent. And this is the scariest thing. Many documents show that the more brutal these punishments are, the more the people that control each other. You don't need too many guards because the people themselves will warn each other. Don't let yourself be the next one. Boiling alive was the perfect psychological puzzle for the rulers of that time, both eliminating the enemy and making the whole society fall into a cycle of fear and obedience. But when placed next to today's human rights standards, the big question is, have we really moved away from that cruel mindset? In the next section, we will compare this punishment to modern society and ask the question, if boiling alive existed today, how would the world react? Today, the world has changed. We talk a lot about human rights, about the right to a fair trial. But the question is, have we really moved away from the idea of brutal punishment? In most countries, punishments like boiling alive are considered barbaric and a serious violation of human rights. But there are still places where public executions are carried out with the purpose of deterrence not much different from hundreds of years ago. The big difference is that today we hide death from the public. Back then, death was a show. However, the psychological factor still exists. When society wants to send a strong message, punishment is always the most effective tool. Let's put ourselves in a hypothetical situation. If tomorrow, a country reinstated the punishment of boiling alive, broadcast live on television, with the reason of deterring serious crimes, what do you think the reaction would be? Outrage? Or would there be people who sympathize? Does the goal of deterrence justify brutality? Does fear really make society safer? Or does it just turn us into more sophisticated versions of the rulers of old? In retrospect, boiling alive is not just a story about punishment, but a mirror of how power is maintained, through fear, through show, and through painful memories. At the end, we wrap up the story from London to the Mongolian steppe and open the door to punishments even more haunting than being cooked alive. If you want to know what screaming turned into music sounds like, don't miss it. From the damp streets of 16th century London to the vast steppes of the Mongol Empire, boiling alive has always been a symbol of absolute power. It not only kills one person, but also inscribes fear into the hearts of thousands of onlookers. Richard Roose, a common cook, becomes a public criminal to deter the whole society. Mongol warriors turn the pot into a psychological weapon to maintain iron discipline. And in both stories, power is always linked to cruelty. We may have left this punishment in the past, but the principle it embodies, using fear to control, is still there, just in a different form. And it is this that makes history never truly sleep. The gurgling drops of the last century have now stopped, but the sound still echoes in history books, in collective memory. It reminds us that when power is unchecked, humans can turn anything, even a pot, into an instrument of hell. If you want to continue your journey of discovering the most gruesome punishment methods in history, then don't miss the next story. The Brazen Bull, a torture machine that turned the screams of its victims into deadly music. I've put the link right here. What do you think? Is boiling alive the most cruel punishment ever? Or just a small part of the dark treasure of human history? Leave a comment, because your answer may open the next stories.